The letter that changed everything. The funeral parlor's artificial lilies couldn't mask the scent of betrayal that had been suffocating me for weeks. As I stood beside my husband's casket, watching a woman half my age sob theatrically into a tissue, I realized that some deaths reveal more about the living than they do about the dead. My name is Margaret Elena Thornton, and at 52 I had thought I understood the architecture of my life. For 28 years, I had been married to David Thornton, a successful real estate developer in our small Connecticut town of Millbrook. I was the dutiful wife, the one who organized charity galas, managed our colonial home on Elm Street, and smiled graciously at every business dinner. I was also, as I discovered 3 weeks before David's sudden heart attack, the wife who had been systematically deceived. The woman weeping so dramatically was Cassandra Price, 26 years old, blonde, and apparently the recipient of not only my husband's affections, but also a significant portion of what I had believed to be our shared assets. She had the audacity to approach me after the service, her mascara carefully smudged, her black dress more appropriate for a cocktail party than a funeral. "Margaret," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "I know this must be so hard for you. David talked about you often." The way she said it, with that slight upturn at the corner of her mouth, made it clear that whatever David had said hadn't been flattering. "I hope you know that what we had was real love. The kind that transcends conventional arrangements." I stood there, surrounded by mourners offering their condolences, and felt something cold and sharp crystallize in my chest. Not rage, that would come later. This was something quieter, more dangerous. This was the moment when I decided that the truth, no matter how ugly, deserved its day in court. That evening, alone in the house that suddenly felt like a mausoleum, I sat in David's study, a room I had rarely entered during our marriage, respecting what he called his private space. Now, with the legal right of a widow, I began the methodical process of examining the remnants of my husband's life. The first box of documents revealed the financial architecture of his betrayal: bank statements showing regular transfers to an account in Cassandra's name, real estate transactions that had mysteriously excluded my signature, despite laws that should have required it, investment portfolios I had never heard of, built with money I had assumed was secure in our joint accounts. But it was in the third box, wedged between tax returns and business contracts, that I found the letter that would change everything. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, and bore my name in David's careful handwriting. Inside, dated just 2 weeks before his death, was a confession that read like a man's attempt to negotiate with his own conscience. "My dearest Margaret, if you are reading this, then I am dead, and you have discovered what I could never find the courage to tell you while I lived. I have been a coward and a fraud, and I have stolen more from you than money. I have stolen 28 years of your truth. Cassandra is not my first affair, though she is the one that has lasted longest. For 15 years I have been living a double life, maintaining relationships with different women while coming home to you each night. I told myself I loved you, but I realize now that what I loved was the security you provided, the respectability, the cover of normalcy that our marriage gave me. The money, our money, I have used it to support this other life. The condo on Harbor Street is in Cassandra's name, but I bought it. The business investments you thought were failing, they were successful, but I've been funneling profits into accounts you don't know about. I have been preparing to leave you, Margaret, but I was too weak to face your strength. You deserve so much more than I ever gave you. You deserve to know that your instincts were always right. When you questioned those late business meetings, when you wondered about the phone calls I took in private, when you asked why our financial situation never seemed to improve despite my apparent success. You were right to doubt, and I was wrong to make you doubt yourself. I know this letter is insufficient, but there are documents in my safe. The combination is your birthday that will help you reclaim what I stole. Also, Cassandra doesn't know about the other accounts, the ones I kept even from her. She believes she was my only secret, but she was just my most recent one. I hope someday you can forgive me, though I know I don't deserve it. David." I read the letter 3 times, each reading revealing new layers of calculation and cruelty. David hadn't just betrayed me, he had systematically gaslit me for decades, making me question my own perceptions while he methodically stole from our joint life to fund his parallel existence. The safe, hidden behind a false panel in his study's bookshelf, contained exactly what he had promised: bank statements, property deeds, investment portfolios,
and most damaging of all, a collection of love letters from not just Cassandra, but three other women over the years. The letters revealed a pattern of manipulation that was breathtaking in its consistency. David would present himself as trapped in a loveless marriage, unable to leave because of his business obligations and social standing. He promised each woman that he was working toward a divorce, that they just needed to be patient. But perhaps most revealing were David's own drafts, letters he had written but never sent, practicing his lies, refining his manipulations. In one, addressed to a woman named Susan from 7 years ago, he had written, "Margaret is a good woman, but she's become bitter and suspicious. She questions everything I do, makes me feel like a prisoner in my own home. Being with you reminds me what love should feel like." I had become bitter and suspicious. I realized, because I was living with a man who was systematically lying to me, my instincts had been sound, my reality had been false. The next morning, I called my attorney, Helen Kowalski, a woman I had known socially but had never imagined I would need professionally. Helen was perhaps 60, silver-haired, with the kind of sharp intelligence that made lesser lawyers nervous. "Margaret," she said, reviewing the documents I had brought, "this is one of the most comprehensive cases of marital fraud I've seen. Your husband essentially created a shadow financial life. The good news is that Connecticut law is very clear about this. Assets hidden during marriage remain marital property, regardless of whose name they're in." Over the following weeks, Helen and her team worked with forensic accountants to trace the full extent of David's deception. The numbers were staggering: over $2.3 million in assets that should have been joint property, including the Harbor Street condo, three investment accounts, and a boat I had never seen. But the money, I was discovering, was secondary to something else I needed: the truth to be known. Cassandra, it turned out, had been telling people around town that she and David had been planning to marry, that I had been the obstacle to their happiness. She had positioned herself as the grieving would-be widow, collecting sympathy and, I suspected, preparing to make claims on David's estate. I decided she deserved to know exactly what kind of man she had been mourning. The confrontation happened at Murphy's Cafe on Main Street, a place where Cassandra had been holding court with her version of events. I walked in during the lunch rush, when the cafe was full of people who knew both of us, and asked if I could join her table. "Of course," she said, though her smile was wary. "How are you holding up?" I placed David's letter on the table between us, along with photocopies of his correspondence with the other women.
I thought you should know, I said, my voice carrying clearly in the suddenly quiet cafe, that you weren't David's only secret. According to his own letters, you were just his most recent one. I watched her face change as she read, watched the color drain from her cheeks as she realized that every promise David had made to her, he had made to others, that she wasn't the great love of his life, but the latest in a long line of women he had used and lied to. "This isn't," she started, but her voice trailed off as she reached the letters from the other women, letters that used phrases identical to ones she had probably treasured receiving from David. "He was planning to leave me for you," I asked. "That's what he told you." "It's what he told Susan Morrison 7 years ago, and Janet Collins before that. Always planning to leave, never quite managing it." The cafe had gone completely silent. I could feel the weight of attention. But I wasn't performing for an audience. I was simply stating facts. "The condo he bought you?" I continued. "It's being sold to recover marital assets. The money he spent on you came from accounts that legally belonged to both of us. I'm not taking it personally, Cassandra. You were deceived too. But you were deceived by a man who made lying into an art form." She looked up at me then, and I saw something I hadn't expected: genuine shock and hurt. For all her youth and beauty, she had been as manipulated as I had been. David had crafted a version of reality for her just as elaborate and false as the one he had maintained for me. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I know you didn't," I said, and I meant it. "But now you do. And now everyone else does too." I left her there with the letters and walked home through the center of town where I had lived for nearly 3 decades. People looked at me differently now, not with pity, but with something like respect. Word would spread, as it always did in small towns. The truth would become part of the public record, but the real reckoning came later, in the privacy of my own rebuilt life. The legal proceedings took 8 months. Helen's team was thorough and relentless, and Connecticut's equitable distribution laws were on my side. I recovered the $2.3 million in hidden assets, plus additional damages for the fraudulent transfers. More importantly, I gained something I hadn't possessed in years: clarity. The house on Elm Street felt too large and too full of ghosts, so I sold it and bought a smaller place on the outskirts of town, a craftsman bungalow with a garden that needed work and windows that faced east toward the morning sun. I resigned from the charity boards and social committees that had structured my life as David's wife, keeping only the literacy program at the library, work that felt meaningful rather than obligatory. I also started seeing Dr. Patricia Reeves, a therapist who specialized in what she called complex grief, the particular challenge of mourning someone who had caused tremendous damage while they lived. "You're not just grieving David's death," Dr. Reeves explained during one of our sessions. "You're grieving the death of your marriage, which actually happened years ago, and the death of the version of yourself who trusted so completely that she ignored her own instincts." It was difficult work, excavating 28 years of self-doubt and misplaced loyalty. I had spent so long adjusting my perceptions to match David's lies that I had to learn to trust my own judgment again. I had to forgive myself for staying, for not investigating sooner, for choosing peace over truth too many times. But perhaps the most challenging part was recognizing that I had played a role in maintaining the fiction of our marriage. Not the affairs, those were entirely David's choice and responsibility. But I had chosen comfort over confrontation, had allowed myself to be gaslit, rather than face the possibility that my life was built on deception. "That doesn't make you complicit," Dr. Reeves reminded me. "It makes you human. We all choose familiar pain over unfamiliar truth sometimes." The turning point came about a year after David's death, when I ran into Cassandra at the grocery store. She looked older somehow, more subdued. She approached me hesitantly. "Margaret," she said, "I owe you an apology for the funeral and for everything. I understand now that I was as deceived as you were." I studied her face, looking for calculation or performance, but saw only genuine remorse. "We were both victims of the same man," I said finally. "The difference is that you were young enough to recover quickly. I wasted 28 years. You didn't waste them," she said quietly. "You survived them, and you found the strength to expose the truth when it mattered. I'm not sure I would have been that brave." After she left, I stood in the cereal aisle and realized that I no longer felt angry with her. The anger had been necessary for a while. It had given me the energy to fight for what was rightfully mine. But holding on to it now would only poison the new life I was trying to build. 2 years after David's death, I am a different woman than I was when I stood beside his casket. I wake up in my sun-filled bedroom and drink coffee in a garden that I planted and tend myself. I have learned to trust my instincts again, to value my own perceptions, to distinguish between intuition and paranoia. I volunteer 3 days a week at the Literacy Center, working with adults who are learning to read. There's something profound about watching someone decode their first sentence, about being present for the moment when letters become words, become meaning. It reminds me that it's never too late to learn new ways of understanding the world. I have also, unexpectedly, begun dating. His name is Robert Chen, a widowed professor of history at the community college, a man whose wife died of cancer 3 years ago. He is kind and direct, someone who says what he means and means what he says. When he tells me he'll call on Tuesday, he calls on Tuesday. When he says he's thinking of me, I believe him. "You have trust issues," he observed gently, after I questioned him about a business trip that would keep him away for a weekend. "I have earned trust issues," I replied, and he laughed. "Fair enough," he said. "How do I earn your trust back?" The question surprised me with its directness, its assumption that trust was something that could be rebuilt, rather than something that, once broken, was lost forever. "Time," I told him. "Consistency. Saying what you mean. I can do that," he said. And so far, he has. I keep David's letter in my desk drawer, not as a wound to be picked at, but as a reminder of what I survived and what I learned. It reminds me that people are capable of extraordinary cruelty, but also that truth, however delayed, has its own power. The money David stole has been restored to me, but that was never the real prize. The real victory was reclaiming my own reality, learning to trust my instincts, refusing to be gaslit into doubting what I could see clearly. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if David had lived, if I had confronted him with what I knew. Would he have confessed? Would he have promised to change?
Would I have been weak enough to believe him again? I think I know the answer, and it both saddens and liberates me. I would probably have given him another chance, would have chosen the familiar pain of a damaged marriage over the unfamiliar challenge of starting over at 52. His death, in a strange way, was a gift. It forced me to confront the truth without the complications of his presence, his explanations, his manipulation. It allowed me to grieve the marriage I thought I had while building a life based on reality rather than illusion. Now, when I look in the mirror, I see a woman who has been tested and has not broken. I see someone who chose truth over comfort, who chose justice over peace, who chose to rebuild rather than simply endure. I am 54 years old, and I am just beginning to understand who I am when I am not adapting to someone else's lies. I am discovering that I am braver than I thought, more resilient than I knew, more deserving of honesty and respect than I ever demanded. The betrayal that once threatened to destroy me has instead become the foundation of a more authentic life. I would not choose to experience it again, but I would not undo it either. It taught me that survival is not just about enduring damage, it's about refusing to let that damage define the rest of your story. Every morning, I wake up in a house filled with truth, in a life built on my own choices, surrounded by people who value honesty as much as I do. It is a smaller life than the one I lived as David's wife, but it is entirely mine. And that, I have learned, is worth everything.